at history, the tribes of the Israelites and the Judeans, which is what comprises what are now commonly called Israelis, that dates back to at least 4,000 years ago. There are direct primary source references to the tribes of Israel.
Like Russia and China, they are not possessing this infidelity for any of them.
Russia and China are, it's a relationship of convenience. Friends with benefits, as they say in a social context. So, right after the First World War, when the mandatory of Palestine was established, there was a massive influx of Jews from all over.
Welcome to the Single World News podcast. I'm your host Jenny, and today we have a truly remarkable guest with us, Mr. Shamik Moitra, a financial economist turned private equity investor. His 30-year career spans prestigious institutions like Accenture, Credit Suisse, and more. But that's just the beginning. In 2008, he ventured to India to kickstart Aditya Birla Group's private equity business. Today, he's a key player in distressed enterprise buyouts. Mr. Shamik is not just about finance. He's a geo-economics, international history, and strategic affairs enthusiast. He is also a published poet working on his second anthology. Stay tuned for a captivating conversation with Shamik Moitra on Geopolitics Unveiled. Today we are here with Mr. Shamik Moitra. So here he is.
Namaskar, thank you very much.
So we are glad to have you here today. As you know that Hamas conflict, this Israel-Hamas conflict is on everyone's mind. So in a recent poll given to choice to Palestinians, among three options for ending the occupation and building an independent state, about 21% prefer negotiations, 22% peaceful popular resistance, and 52% selected armed conflict. A 58% majority support a return to the armed terrorism and confrontations. So what are your thoughts on this conflict, if you could kindly share with us?
I think there are a lot of myths and misconceptions swirling around this conflict. And before diving into it, the way I'd like to look at it is sort of unpack it along the lines of its history so that we understand the context. I'd like to look at the fault lines as they exist today globally, which is what has caused this conflict. And then finally, perhaps it will be useful to see what the impact of this is on our lives. So both globally as well as specifically, which is related to India. So firstly, of course, thank you very much for having me and giving me this wonderful platform to speak and communicate with people who are interested in this topic. So before I dive into the history bit, so there were four things that we need to look at. So before the history bit, it's very interesting that a poll was conducted in America amongst American Muslims, and they were asked the same question: what are you looking for? Would you think that there should be a peaceful resolution, or should there be a conflict? Should there be war? And 58% of the people polled said that conflict is the only way forward. So there seems to be a religious angle which is dominating the discourse. And I think it's also important to bust that in certain ways. It is an ethno-religious conflict, and the roots of it are several millennia old, in a sense. So firstly, let us understand one dimension where people claim that Israel and Israelis are occupiers. They came from outside, and the Palestinians were the local residents, and they were displaced. In fact, the United Nations recognizes them as displaced people. Fairly uniquely, they are not just displaced people; they are, considered displaced in their own land. This is in itself a myth, and I'll tell you why. Firstly, let's look at the word Palestine. Palestine is a construct which dates no older than 1919. Why do I say that? So if you look at history, the tribes of the Israelites and the Judeans, which is what comprises what are now commonly called Israelis, that dates back to at least 4,000 years ago. There are direct primary source references to the tribes of Israel, and about 3,000, 2,800, 3,000 years ago, they were displaced to Egypt, where many of them were taken as slaves by the Egyptian pharaohs. And then there's this whole story of Moses going back through Sinai and through the Canaan area and settling back in what is now Israel. If I look for references to Palestine, there are none, but there is reference, for example, in the Old Testament to people called Philistines. And Philistines is not really a tribe, it's more of a catch-all for, I would say, people from all over the area. We're not part of any specific tribe, but they settled in what is now roughly the Gaza Strip, modern day Gaza Strip. And Philistines were supposed to be less cultured, less educated, etc., etc. A lot of epithets were hurled towards them. I'm not condoning it, I'm just saying that's the way it is treated. So you had Philistines, who were sort of uncivilized, and you had the Gentiles, who were the most civilized people, the normal folk of Israel and Jerusalem, etc. Then if you go across to the Roman times, Rome conquered pretty much everything below the Anatolian plateau, all the way up to the river Euphrates, and they were stopped there by the Parthians. They obviously controlled Egypt, and they controlled this entire area which is now known as Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, whatever. And they named this area as Palestine. It's a Roman, it's a Latin word which is a derivative. It's a Latin word which is a derivative. Romans are the only people who used it. They did so for 4 centuries, after which, of course, the Roman Empire disappeared from this area. It was replaced by the Eastern Roman Empire centered on Byzantine, right? Which was, by the time it was established, it adopted Christianity. And then you see the Jewish people always lived here. The Jewish people never moved out. The diaspora, the word diaspora is again a Greek term which effectively means people who have left. And diasporation of the Jewish people again happened between, let us say, from the time when the Byzantine Empire turned Christian, and they began certain level of repression and oppression of non-Christian tribal groups and ethnic groups. And Jews were principal amongst them in this area. And they started moving to other parts of the world. They moved across to Europe. Some people went across to North Africa, in what is now modern day Algeria, for instance, and Tunisia. Some of them went east towards what is now called Iraq. Back then it was Mesopotamia. And some of them, in fact, left and settled in the western coast of India. So there was diasporation, but diasporation was not emptying of the land. So here is the myth. It was not like the Jewish people had all gone away, there was nobody left. I would say roughly 40 to 50% of the population may have got displaced over a period of, say, 1,000 years, say between 400 ACE till about, say, 1400, 1500 ACE. And then the balance remained. They always were there, and they used to live alongside the Arabs. And there were several Arab tribes. People who lived in the Hejaz were a different tribe, which is now Saudi Arabia. People who lived in Jordan or further north in Syria and Iraq, which was then Mesopotamia, were a different tribe. These are all Arab tribes. The Philistines continued to be this small pocket of people who were neither Arabs nor local. Who are the Philistines? The Philistines of that era, I'm not referring to the Philistines of Moses' era. So I'm talking about this era which is from the Dark Ages to the medieval times. These are people who were essentially, their DNA mapping actually shows they came from the Caucasus, they came from places like Bosnia, modern day Bosnia, they came from other parts of Central Europe, and they were brought in by the Ottoman Empire, the Byzantines before them, the Christian kingdoms of the Crusades and Byzantine. Slaves of those people, plus the slaves of the Ottomans, some of them were freed, some of them just ran away, and they actually settled in this narrow strip of land, which was fairly inhospitable. There's another myth that we keep hearing, for example, Yasser Arafat, I remember, used to say that we had these green hills of of Palestine, and that's now been taken over by the Jews. Entirely wrong. From all accounts, it was extremely inhospitable, and that's why these people were allowed to dwell there. Had they moved to the fertile areas of the Crescent or the fertile areas of Egypt, they would have faced opposition. So nobody bothered them, they sort of settled there. And because the local language was, there were roughly only two languages, Hebrew and Arabic. So they started speaking Arabic because they were not Jews. Therefore, they had to speak Arabic, and they spoke Arabic. Some of them were Christians, some of them were, they had converted to Sunni Islam because they were captured initially by people like Saladin, right, who was the person responsible for driving the Christians out of this entire area, Tyre, Sidon, Jerusalem, Gaza, etc. And he ruled this region. And so they converted to Islam. Some of them remained Christian, and they actually settled in the hills of Lebanon. Their descendants are now known as Druze. Same people, but they are essentially people who have migrated from elsewhere or been captured as slaves, have remained there, taken to the local language and the local religion. They say they're Arabs, but if you go and talk to any Jordanian, you talk to any person from Saudi Arabia or from Egypt, they refuse to recognize these people as Arabs because they are not Arabs. They're essentially white Europeans who were converted to Islam. Some of them remained Christian, but 90-95% of them converted to Sunni Islam. So that's the history of this region till the sort of medieval times. Now, if we cut down towards the latter half of the 19th century, that's when the real trouble started between people called Palestinian now and the Jews of the area. Why did this trouble start? Well, the Jews always had this tradition, particularly the diaspora Jew, next year in Jerusalem, which means that's the land they left, they lost it. So they had this custom of always celebrating and remembering it. And they maintained their culture by memory, by remembering all these things and their places and things that they held dear by constantly repeating next year in Jerusalem. In the 19th century, we had this movement called Zionism. Zionism is not a racial movement, it's a movement for acknowledging ancestry and acknowledging where you belong. It's more about belongingness. So if you belong to a specific land and you've been displaced, you want to go back there. Now, Zionism was about establishing a state because a section of Jews realized that just being influential or part of society in other places where they were discriminated against, but they were also successful. They always were very successful at financing the wars in Europe or participating in art and literature and sciences. So they were people who were always very progressive and they wanted to integrate, but the integration wasn't possible because the history of Europe from say the 8th or 9th century all the way down to say the 17th, 18th century, not counting the Enlightenment, so-called Enlightenment period in Italy, was a history of deep intolerance. You had wars between Protestants and Christians, the 30 Years' War, for example. It was ruinous. Fully 1/7 of Europe was wiped out in that war. People don't remember this these days, and that led to the Treaty of Westphalia, for example. All through these years, this intolerance manifested universally against the Jews. So Jews always felt insecure, even if they had adapted local customs and were speaking French or English or German or whatever. So they felt by the 19th century, when the power of the Ottoman Empire was declining by this time, and the Europeans were rising, both in influence and power, they felt that maybe it's time for us to now consider going back. So an international movement which had its genesis in America, but also in the local areas in Palestine, which was not called Palestine, it was simply an area administered by the Ottoman Empire, there was this movement to reclaim land. Here's the thing, the process by which it was done was by buying land, actually buying land locally, either from Arabs or by registering new land with the Ottoman Turks. And some Jews started trickling back. It was still not a big wave. So you had this local Jewish population and some Jews trickling back from the rest of the world. Now, if you look at the First World War, by the end of that war, the Ottoman Turks, their empire was destroyed. And what you had is a situation where the British and the French took over all the areas in the Middle East for administration. they had something called the League of Nations, which is the predecessor of the current United Nations.
Yes.
And the League of Nations created a mandate, an international mandate, wherein territories were given over to powerful nations to administer. It's just colonialism by another name, but that's the way it was. It was called mandatory territories. So Transjordan, which has now become Jordan, the Hejaz area of what is now the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, this new area which includes what's now West Bank, Gaza, and current day Israel, all of this was called Palestine. Then you had Syria, Iraq, Lebanon. All of these areas were split amongst the division of French. Now the British took over this area, which is now the center of our conflict between Palestinians and the Israelis, and they called it Palestine. Now I want to highlight this word Palestine. It's very important to understand. Like I said, if you look at Ottoman Turk maps, there's no word called Palestine ever. If you look at anything else the British used or the French used while they were fighting the Ottoman Turks, or Lawrence of Arabia, who was leading a rebellion of the Arabs, there's no mention of Palestine per se. So Palestine, the name was borrowed from the Romans, who used to call it that. They simply had designated the area of Palestine. It was a derivative, Latin derivative of the Greek Philistine, right? So they called the area Palestine, and therefore the locals, whether you're Jew or Arab or the Philistini, you are essentially Palestinian, right? As part of the British mandate. So that's where this whole Palestine concept comes up. Now there are three separate instances centered on one gentleman called Lord Balfour. Lord Balfour was a British administrator, and he came up with what's now famously known as the Balfour Declaration, where it was determined that two things, two very important doctrines. One was that all the dominions within the British Empire had the same status. Now it doesn't matter whether you're a colony or not, you have the same status and all are equal, which means the status of a Palestinian citizen is the same as that of an Indian, is the same as that of say a Javanese, is the same as that of a Kenyan, the same as that of a New Zealander. That's the way it was structured. And it recognized the right of people to determine their future at some stage. Obviously the British determined that people are not ready yet. Like that's the classic precept of colonialism. Oh, they are not ready, they're not mature enough. The reality is, this for the first time acknowledged that these people have rights to their own territory, they have to be treated equally, etc., etc. Now, the direct impact of that was that now if you want to live in Palestine, you have to report to the British authorities. So you want to pay taxes, you pay to the British authorities, who in turn do your civic services. They deliver civic services, they protect you, they give you law and order, etc., etc. So if you're living there or you wish to live there, you have to acquire the rights to live there. And the rights came from two sources. Either you are already there, or if you're migrating inwards, you have to buy something, you have to buy property. So, right after the First World War, when the mandatory of Palestine was established, there was a massive influx of Jews from all over, who were, the Zionist movement had caught their imagination. But there was nothing they could negotiate with. The Ottoman Turks were not very willing to, they were quite reluctant to let Jews come back and again resettle this area. Jews had always been troublesome. People forget that the Turks, the state called Turkey, is a combination of the old Anatolian Greeks. Most of them are actually Anatolian Greeks, and the Turkic tribes which migrated from Central Asia, the heartland. They conquered this place, and they took over what was the original Christian Byzantine Empire. It was still Byzantine. Constantinople became Istanbul. It was the same people, right? Those people were always facing trouble from the Jews, who were a restive tribe, so they were not really welcome. So whether it was the old Christians or the new Islamic Turkish Caliphate, nobody really wanted them. So the Jews could not negotiate with anybody and return to their land, right? However, after the British took over, the British legal system, one thing very good about it, whether it's in the colonies or in its own home territories, is that property rights are very clear. That's one advantage and we have to accept it. In fact, property rights per se is a doctrine established very firmly within Magna Carta. So that's unchallengeable, unassailable. So the Jews negotiated, they bought land. They took permission, they bought the land and then resettled. So this whole notion, why am I giving this whole long-winded description, is because this whole notion of Palestinians being displaced is wrong, because either they sold the land or the British authorities sold the land. If you buy land, it's your land. End of story. Then nobody can claim, oh, it was my land. It's not right. So if you buy a house, I can't come back and say, hey, you know what, 100 years ago some ancestor of mine used to live right next to you, this is my house. I can't say that. It doesn't work that way. So the Jews had every legal right established by any kind of, any framework of law you may look at, international or local, to be there. Ones who were already there, plus the ones who migrated. So there was no displacement of either Arabs or Palestinians. They were now calling themselves Palestinians by this time. Yeah. The non-Jewish population, which was a combination of 95% Sunnis, 2% Shias and 3% Christians, they were calling themselves Palestinians. Now, 1937 is a watershed year, because that's when the British government tried to negotiate with local Palestinians and local Jews about a settlement. Which means that you figure out a mechanism by which we can create a demarcated territory for the Palestinians and for the Jews, and everybody can live happily ever after. Now, I won't say they were completely altruistic or benign about this. They had their own designs. They wanted to keep people divided. So that old Roman concept of divide and rule, which the British Empire adopted very successfully, was also applied over here. However, the Jews were at that stage, they were not a very aggressive race, and they really wanted to compromise to settle, because they came from a background of successful trading, successful banking, negotiating, etc. So they wanted to apply it here, and they said, okay, right, let's demarcate, we just want this much. And the demarcation was such that Arabs would be left with 80% of the land, which includes Jordan. And Palestinians would also have almost the same land as the Jews, who were slightly higher in number at that stage because of migration. So the Palestinians would have none of it. This is not, we are not going to accept it. We are not going to accept it. All of this is ours. These people are encroachers, so they should go. That's when for the first time you heard the slogan, from the river to the sea, Palestine is free. Yes. Which you are now hearing as one of the war cries of the Hamas people and in West Bank. Yeah. Yes. So which means that you don't belong here. You Jews can just shove off to the sea. This is all our land. Yes. 1947 is when the British declared they are going to leave Palestine, give up their mandate, and transition the authority to local Jews and to local Arabs. So an India-Pakistan kind of situation was happening there as well. And in 1948 they did go. And they left precipitately with no real handing over of power. So suddenly you have British, you have got a functioning administration, functioning police system, and functioning courts, and suddenly you have nothing. Imagine the situation, it's chaos. And you have not resolved the central conflict, which has now existed for 1917 to 1947, which is 30 years, 31st year, unresolved conflict, ancient history of resentment and rivalry, and Jews who also don't have a government structure. So they had to rapidly form a government, right? Which they did. Ben-Gurion, etc., all of these people. Golda Meir was then just a minister. And then what happens is that at that stage, all the Arab nations which surrounded this territory of Palestine, which is now declared as Israel, they attacked Jerusalem and they invaded the rest of what is now Israel. So it was a combination of mainly Jordanian forces who were the first to attack. There was this famous commander called Colonel Abdullah Tell, he led an armored column into Jerusalem. That's when the 1948 war started. Right after, combination of forces from Syria, what is now Lebanon, ex-French territory, Iraq, Mesopotamia, which had become Iraq by this time, and Egypt, they all attacked. They all supported. And even the new kingdom of Saudi Arabia, they sent some forces as well. So suddenly this new state, which is not even a state yet, doesn't even have an elected legislature. It's just forming, it's a process of forming it. And they only have guerrilla fighters. Incidentally, what I have not mentioned is there was a level of armed violence already simmering for those 30 years that the British administered the territory. between extreme elements of impatient elements within the Jews, local Palestinians, and the British police and military. So this was already going on. So you had a modicum of, I would say, armed resistance. Also, the displaced Jews from Europe who had come in, they had suffered war, and they had been, most of them were massacred by the Nazi forces, but they were prepared to fight because they were desperate. For them, this was the last hope. So, be that as it may, the French and later the Americans and the British did fly in weapons. It was touch and go. Till the last moment, Truman didn't want to recognize this government, but he was prevailed upon, and arms and equipment was sent, limited amount, to enable the Jews to fight. Now, they were determined and they succeeded. They had been training, about 20,000 people had been training very hard to become a successful modern army without equipment. So they didn't have equipment, but they had the will and they had the desperation. So they succeeded. So you have this state of Israel which comes into being. It's recognized and accepted in the United Nations, although it's rejected by all the 57 Muslim nations. 56 then, because Pakistan was Bangladesh plus Pakistan, so it was one nation. So 56. India recognizes it, but India also recognized once, a two-state solution. Right from get-go, Nehru was a supporter of the two-state solution. So the Indian government was advocating a two-state solution, leaning towards the Palestinians and the Arab position on this. Now, this is the stage where the Arabs did not yet have control over their oil resources. So they were not as economically powerful. They did not have strong armies, with the exception of Egypt, which was militarily powerful thanks to the leftover of the Second World War, when they were the main base of the British who hammered German forces. So Egypt had a strong army, and the rest of them were, I would say, more disorganized masses. The Israelis had one advantage. Many of them had actually fought as officers and as lower ranks in the war, and therefore they used that to train and build a proper modern army, which was a conscript army. They introduced this whole system of, you have to spend 3 years minimum in the Israeli army, and then going to reserve, and the rest will continue in the army. So that system came into being. So now let's look at Palestinians as well. What are they doing at this stage? So the Palestinians, essentially, having lost the war, West Bank was captured by Jordanians, by the way. West Bank, as in the River Jordan. The West Bank includes Jerusalem. West Bank is where currently the Palestinian Authority has its territory. So Jordan owned it, and but because they ran a successful campaign, and Sinai was part of Egypt. It was not part of Israel. So we have a situation where Palestinians are feeling a little bit abandoned at this stage, because after the Arab nations lost the war, they were sort of left to their own devices. See, remember, in 1948 and in the 50s, the Arabs still don't have control over their oil resources. They don't have the money, enough adequate funds. So the Palestinians now start adopting terrorist tactics, because they felt that we don't have sufficient resources to resist or to reclaim back what we think is ours. And I've explained it is not, but that's what they felt. So they started resorting to terrorist tactics, and we had the beginnings of what is now was later called the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. I think it used to be called something else. I'm forgetting the earlier name. They were not using quite, I would not quite say guerrilla tactics. A lot of people like to say that these were not guerrilla tactics. They were actually hit and run and bombings, creating terror, etc., in areas within Israel and where the Palestinians lived. So that's been going on now. If you count from the 50s till today, that's 70 years plus. For 70 years, we've had the same situation. And clearly, 4 generations or maybe 5 generations of Palestinians have grown up just knowing this and nothing else. Now, let's, the next significant bit, I will not get into the Israeli-Arab War of 1967, which the Israelis won handily and conquered the Sinai Desert, and they captured the Golan Heights. all of that is not so important. What is important is at this stage, the Arabs had started coming, like for example, UAE as a state emerged in 1961. In 1948, there was no UAE, didn't exist. So there were a raft of new Arab states with a lot of oil and natural gas, basically energy resources, which they were selling and they were getting money from. So they started getting rich. 1973 was a real watershed. Till this point, the leadership of the Arab and the Muslim world at large was centered on Egypt and Pakistan, the two most militarily strong nations till that point. 71, Pakistan loses the war handsomely, if one can use that phrase, to India, and its importance diminishes as a leader nation. Okay. Egypt, on the other hand, still continues. Egypt is still powerful. And in 1973, they came to an inch of defeating Israel. This is what is not recognized. The Israelis did manage to push them back finally and reclaim most of the territory that was lost. And Israelis suffered very heavily, but so did the Arabs. I think the best way to describe it is a sort of, in strategic terms, a stalemate with leaning towards in favor of Israel as an outcome, because the aim was to destroy Israel, wipe it off the map. They didn't succeed, therefore it's an Israeli victory. And it's a defeat for the Arabs because they didn't succeed with their war aims. Now, this is the point where OPEC gets formed. The Arabs suddenly seize all the oil and natural gas assets of their own countries, and they create an oil cartel, an energy cartel. Now that gives them immense power, both in terms of dictating the geopolitical, I would say, cross currents between nations, as well as the capacity to now start giving money to Palestine Liberation Organization. Now, a lot of things happened between 1970 and 73, and this is very important to understand what's going on today. Number one, you had the PLO, right? Yasser Arafat being one of its young Turks, and you had something called the Black September. In Jordan, which, by the way, if you remember, I did say that Jordan had captured West Bank. The Israelis seized it back during the 67 war, right? And but the population was Palestinian, and they were part of Jordan, right? They launched a full-blown rebellion against the Jordanian king. Now, these are your benefactors. He's allowed you to settle in camps. He's feeding, literally paying for your existence, but they rebelled, right? So that, by the way, to a large extent, destroyed I would say, the Jordanian support for Palestinian causes other than lip service. And to some extent, the Egyptians also got shaken by that rebellion. 25,000 Palestinians were killed, 4,000 of whom were killed by one Lieutenant Colonel Zia-ul-Haq, whose name might be familiar to our Indian audience. And the rebellion was crushed fairly brutally and effectively. And at this stage, a lot of Palestinians were thrown out of Jordan, and they went and settled in the southern part of what is now Lebanon. Lebanon till this point was primarily a Shia nation, Shia and Christian nation. Christians were in majority, followed by Shia, followed by Sunni. But these Palestinians went there, that demographic shifted. All this is happening in 1970, 1971. Then you have the Yom Kippur, what is known as the Yom Kippur War, 50 years ago from our current times, where during the festival of Yom Kippur, I just mentioned, led by Egypt, 4 nations attacked Israel, almost won, but the Israelis finally pushed them back. This is also watershed in the sense that why was the oil cartel formed? Let's also understand that. The agreement between, a lot of things actually have to be unpacked here. Number one, the Americans were in a ruinous war in Vietnam. It had almost ruined the American economy. So the gold-backed currency that they had till that point, created via Bretton Woods, that gold-backed norm was not sustainable because they didn't have enough, they couldn't print enough notes backed by gold to sustain the war effort. So they agreed a compact with the Arabs saying that we will protect you because these are all royals, right? Imposed by the British or the French, as the case may be, not popularly elected. Later on, they became popular through whatever activities and social development. That's a separate story. But they were not popularly elected, so there was always an insecurity within the rulers of the Arab nations. So if big brother America comes and says, I'll give you protection, I only want one thing in return, all the trading of energy will be done in dollars, it will be dollar denominated.
So it was a mutual.
Yeah, it was a mutual, exactly. And once you have that, then the Americans under Nixon, they delinked the dollar from the gold. The gold standard was dropped and it became what is today called fiat currency, i.e. it's dictated by the central bank and by the government. So fiat currency came into being, the fiat dollar came into being at that stage. It's also the inception of the petrodollar, because now petroleum and natural gas is traded in dollars, dollar denominated, which is what the Russians and the Saudis are now trying to break and have broken to some extent. So at this stage, the Saudis get their hands on an unlimited amount of dollars because they have seized their, I'm forgetting something. So why did the Saudis and the others seize their national assets, which were run by companies like Shell, British Petroleum, the American oil companies like Consolidated, etc., Exxon. These were the companies running the oil assets and the energy assets. They seized those assets and nationalized them, and therefore control. They realized that if I control the oil resources, because now it's traded in dollars, I essentially control the global economy effectively. Now, the Americans, because they had chosen to back Israel, 22,500 tons of equipment, ammunition, tanks, etc. flown into Israel. It's very important to understand one more thing, and that will directly have I would say, a link with what's happening today and one of the things people are discussing. So Israel was on its last legs. Its famous general who was then defense minister, he was famous from the 1967 war, which he led to victory, Moshe Dayan. He was so depressed and had literally lost it. He was about to say that you guys go back to Europe, the state is lost, Jerusalem, we're going to lose Jerusalem again. He was on the verge of doing that. So he in fact had to be counseled. And Golda Meir, who was the prime minister, very courageous lady, she decided that no, we will not give in like this. They evolved something known as the Samson doctrine. What is the Samson doctrine? That if we are going to be destroyed, we'll destroy everybody else. But Israel always had nuclear capability, not declared. Now people these days wonder how many nukes does Israel have? Well, I can say for sure at least 13. Why? Because in 1973, they photographed on television and print media the assembly or the final assembly of 13 nuclear devices of 15 to 20 kiloton yield. By the way, that's similar to Hiroshima and Nagasaki kind of.
Okay.
So with 15 to 20 kiloton nuclear devices, that would have wiped out all the neighboring Arab countries. And because their populations are not in the deserts, they're concentrated in cities, big population centers. So they assembled all of them and they mounted them on, I think it was Mirage aircraft. They were to be delivered. And that's when people realized, oh dear, if this goes nuclear, then it can also spark a nuclear war. Because let's remember, back then, the Soviet Union had backed a lot of these Arab states, like Egypt. All the military equipment was Soviet. Syria, Mesopotamia, which is Iraq, they had backed all these nations. So if you attack one of their allies, there's a distinct chance of a Third World War, nuclear war starting. So the Americans they were very reluctant to help the Israelis initially, but at this stage, 1973, Nixon decided, no, we have to help them to stop this situation from devolving further and degrading. So they supplied Israelis with the necessary arms and equipment, and that allowed the Israelis to push back the tide and recapture their lost territories and stop the war. And then, of course, all the powers got in and negotiated a solution. Because the Americans told the Soviets, if we don't do it, these guys are going to go nuke and we can't stop them. The Syrians and the Egyptians, etc. This stage, by the way, Syria and Egypt was one nation called the United Arab Republic, UAR. And at the end of this war, after losing the battle, Syria and Egypt again separated and went their own ways. the House of Saud and the Emiratis and the Bahrainis, Qataris, all of these people got together. They created OPEC, which other nations joined, and they decided that Americans have helped our enemy nation. Remember, till very recently, before the Abraham Accords between Morocco, UAE, Israel, and Bahrain, with USA as a supervisor, till that point, Israel was deemed enemy state by all except Egypt and Jordan, who after the 73 war, they decided, okay, we're not going to be enemies, there'll be a truce. So, enmity with Israel has been a currency within the Arab world. They suddenly acquired a lot of wealth and power because they decided to nationalize the energy assets, and they used it to actually promote. You have to do something with the money, right? So they started promoting many of these extreme ideologies. For example, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the Salafis in the Arabian Peninsula, the Barelvis in Pakistan, and the Deobandis in India. And the Iranians were, of course, they were already on a different trip. It was ruled by the Shah, but the mullahs were on the rise in Iran. So you see, along with the rise of OPEC, a massive rise in the extreme version of Islam which wants to conquer the world and take over. So this is the situation 50 years ago. Since then, what has happened? What has happened is repeated attempts by Palestinians has been replied tenfold by Israelis. So Palestinians went and killed Israeli athletes at the 72 Munich Olympics. Israelis went and killed all of those assassins and the people who planned it and their associates. They didn't leave a single person alive. So that was a kind of retribution. So it was this whole cycle of violence, counter-violence, which kept on going, kept going on and on. So what we have from 1973 is not actual war. I mean, if I look at the actions by Israel, people call the 82 action Israel's war with Lebanon. Not really. I mean, it was so one-sided, you can't really call it war. So you had Palestinian camps and the Israelis march in with their tanks and just blast everything to pieces. And then they use the Druze and other militias to fight amongst each other. And they withdraw. So they're doing this tactically, and it was beautifully done, but it was not really war. It was more of what I would call pure conflict, just conflict, internecine conflict between ethnic and tribal groups or ethno-religious groups. So what we have is the development of this conflict economy. So remember the points that I have, the dots. So you have Saudi Arabia and the others, they have a lot of money and they are supporting the promotion of Islam. The consequence of that is the rising tide of extremism from Pakistan to Algeria to Morocco. In Palestine, West Bank, they gave back West Bank. They said, okay, we are going to give back West Bank, but it will remain within our borders, but we will let it be administered by the Palestinians with Israeli supervision. A more benign form of that is what you see today, and I'll come to that. That happened under Ariel Sharon, the Israeli PM, in 2003. So back to the 70s and the 80s, you see the development of what I call a conflict economy. Now, conflict economy is not necessarily a state of continuous war. It means that the people of a specific area and the people who have the power, the higher power, they're in constant friction, they're in constant conflict. So you have killings, low-level violence at all times, low to medium-level violence, but not really war. So you have bombings, assassinations, counter-assassinations, counter-bombings, punitive raids, stuff like that. Special forces action, which is why you see Israel develop some of the most potent special forces at this time, the Sayeret Matkal being very well known, and then there are others. So the thing is that conflict economy, one has to understand, is not ideology. Ideology is only the face. Conflict economy is more about business. It is a business. Because it's in my interest for this conflict to continue, because I can then say that, hey, I am your leader, I am actually helping you reclaim your land. I am a great Palestinian leader. And my enemy is this Israeli. So you continue with things like stone pelting, demonstrations, protests, writing incendiary articles, etc., keeping the whole issue alive. And in exchange, what do you get? You get NGOs which keep receiving lots of funds, slush money, etc., from nations like Libya, nations like Iran, nations like, at that stage, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Not currently. Saudi Arabia has radically reformed. And this went on right through the 80s and 90s. So Intifada is basically means rebellion. But Intifada, if you look at their tactics, the same thing spread to the other great conflict economy which has now subsided, Kashmir. You had stone pelting in Palestine in the late 80s and early 90s. The same tactics were adapted by the Kashmiris when their armed rebellion failed. So they used these tactics, civil unrest and low-level violence, driving out the other residents with whom you don't want to stay. All of that was adapted and metastasized there. Now, if you look at Hamas, the big horrible name that we keep hearing today, Hamas had its genesis during this phase. When there's no war, PLO itself has got tamed down because Arafat is now a relatively old man. He wants to make peace. He gets his Nobel Prize along with the Israeli PM. And Camp David Accords are signed. So Palestine gets a mandate, again the word mandate, to govern itself. Self-autonomous government, but without really a full statehood. So there was no full statehood. Now at this stage, who gets to govern this place? Oh well, it's the Fatah party. Fatah is like Sinn Féin was the political wing of the Irish Republican Army in Ireland. Similarly, Fatah is the political wing of the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, which is the military wing. Now they were considered too liberal after maybe 1,000 bombings and 10,000 deaths. They were considered too liberal and too benign. Not good enough in terms of the extreme ideologies which are coming up. So you have this NGO, mark this, an NGO called Hamas.
Okay.
Hamas is I think it's an acronym which effectively means resistance. It means something like holy armed resistance.
Why do you call it NGO?
It was formed as an NGO. It was set up as an NGO, literally a non-government organization. Its purpose was to do social work, education, hospitals, that kind of primary healthcare, that kind of stuff. That's how they disguise themselves. Now, by the way, you see the exact same thing in India. There was something called the SIMI, right?
Right.
It was an Islamic students organization, which then metastasized into that Kerala-based organization. I'm forgetting the name right now, which was raided last year and destroyed by the Indian intelligence authorities. The same thing. They were all structured as NGOs. Today, if you look at LET, Jaish-e-Mohammed, all these pro-Kashmir terrorist organizations in Pakistan, they are structured as NGOs. So on the face, they are receiving money for social work. In reality, they are using it to train terrorists. So Hamas was exactly the same. So initially, they showed results. They had to show results to people who were financing them, which was primarily, and here's the funny thing, Hamas is an organization comprising mainly Sunni Muslims. They've always been at loggerheads with Shia, but when it came to financing Hamas, the financing flow was handled by the Qataris, but the money came from Iran. They were not financed by Saudi Arabia. They were not financed by Egypt or even by Syria, which are supposed to be enemies of Israel at one stage. Today, by the way, Jordan, I wouldn't call it a vassal state of Israel, but it's pretty much with the Israelis. The Jordanian Mukhabarat, which is their intelligence agency, and the Israeli Shin Bet regularly meet and trade intelligence. Why would they do that if they're enemies? They're trading intelligence on each other's local issues and problems. So it was financed by Iran. And Iran had just come out of their decade-long futile war with Iraq, which led to nothing. It just ended up killing 1.5 million people. No territory was either won by either side, and its regime had become even more extreme by the process of war. What it did is converted already extreme mullahocracy to an even more extreme theocracy, which wanted to control every aspect of every citizen's life. These were emergency powers they instituted during the war, but they continued after. And then the regime was left free to its own devices. One of its great plans was to seek to reintegrate the old Persian Empire, of Xerxes and Darius and all of that in the ancient times. And for that, they effectively mean the area from what is now Balochistan all the way up to Lebanon. They felt this is all our territory because it was our territory, it was the Persian Empire. And now if you look at what's going on, that's what has happened. What they have done to gain influence and control over these territories, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, these are the countries right next to, one after the other, from Iran to the Mediterranean. And down below Arabia, you have Saudi Arabia, you have Yemen. So they have essentially used their influence to create asymmetric warfare groups. Asymmetric warfare means terrorism, effectively. That's how they influence and control these territories. They keep them forever on the boil and on the cusp of disaster. These are all failed states, by the way. Iraq, Syria, in spite of having a lot of energy resources. Lebanon, which was known as the Paris, Beirut was known as the Paris of the East. And Beirut today is, well, it is what it is. It's still half destroyed, not been fully rebuilt ever. So now let's not think that the only players are the ones we have been just talking about. So Hamas is an organization which came up in both the West Bank, where Fatah controlled the Palestinian Authority, and they displaced the Palestinian Authority completely from the Gaza Strip, which was this narrow strip of land about 31 miles by 6 miles.
Okay.
Right next to the Egyptian-Israeli border at the southwestern tip of Israel. So they displaced them. They in fact shot the Fatah officials. They literally shot them. There was actually, I won't call it civil war, but there was a gang warfare, and they pushed them out. They took over Gaza. There was elections in Gaza, and by the way, the residents of Gaza voted for Hamas. Remember, Hamas started as an NGO. They ran that Intifada kind of thing, which is basically stone pelting to start with. Then they got more funds, etc., etc. Then they took to terrorist attacks, bombings, etc. Then they switched to rocket attacks, homemade rockets. Now they are slightly more sophisticated things, but they are not sophisticated by military standards. They are sophisticated by terrorist standards. So they acquired those things with help from the Iranians, and they have been raining those rockets at the rate of about 50 a day for the last 18 years. However, over the last 2 years, they clearly stockpiled. We'll discuss the military situation in a bit. I just want to end by saying that this is the historical context of what has happened. The Israelis are not occupiers. They are themselves partially displaced people who went back to their home territories. They bought the land, so they have a legal right to be there. Neither are the Palestinians, people who are called Palestinians today, to be just thrown out. Clearly, they also belong there. They have lived there for a couple of thousand years at least, wherever they may have originated. So there has to be a solution, and the only practical solution is to perhaps carve out West Bank and say, okay, this is yours. You are a new state, and something has to obviously be done about Gaza. And I'll come to why, because I'll explain the military situation and why the only solution actually sounds terrible, but it's the only viable solution for Israel to continue functioning as a state. So I want to end this whole thing about historical context with one point, which is, questions. Any questions?
Yeah, sure. So that was an amazing explanation by Mr. Shamik Moitra regarding all the things which we are actually well aware of happening all around the conflict of the war. I would love to receive comments if you people can share regarding any of the things, any of the questions you have. You're always welcome to ask us. So with that move, I would like to ask you here that as you can see the war, the conflict. So what do you think? Like, how will it end? If you can shortly say something about it.
It's a good question, and it's a very complicated question. And I'll tell you why it is complicated. Because I've given you all the history and this conflict economy and all of the stuff that's going on. One has to realize that was always there. That's nothing new. So the critical question we need to ask ourselves is, what changed? Why did Hamas carry out this series of brutal attacks on Israeli citizens? What triggered it? So we have to now look at the geopolitics of the world as it stands. So today we are living in times post-COVID where there are, I'll just give a straight headline, and if there are explanations I can give later. So there are two camps in the world as I see it today. One camp aligns, and the header of that camp is China with the Xi Jinping regime, and it has as its allies and principals Russia, Iran, Turkey, and two-timing Pakistan, which is in both camps in different ways. Pakistan is a very schizophrenic state today. So it's China, Russia, Iran, Turkey as the main players, with China at its head of the table. And then there are lots of subsidiary players, some of which are terrorist organizations, some of which are smaller states. Qataris are very critical in this. Qataris have traditionally for thousands of years been bankers to the Arab world. That's their role. And it continues today. I mean, the worldwide money flows, if I look at it, Qatar has always been an extremely significant player. If I look at its linkages even with the City of London, the global center of the money trade, Qataris have a huge and overwhelming, I would say, an overweight influence on that. Qataris also happen to be a treaty ally of the United States of America. United States of America, outside America and Europe, has the largest military base in Qatar.
Okay.
People don't realize this, so they are protected. Americans will not displace this because this gives them a direct control over the entirety of the Middle East. It's located right smack in the center of the Persian Gulf. Qatar is just this little spur of land jutting out from the Arabian Peninsula on the Persian Gulf. It is separated from Iran by just about, I think, 70-80 miles, not more than that, probably less at certain points. So Qatar is a place from where America, if it wishes to do something, can launch attacks on terrorist targets in Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq. And if it wants to control KSA or UAE, it can do so as well. So Qatar is strategically, geographically located in such a spot that it favors America. The other thing the Qataris have done is, it's actually a tiny nation. There are only 270,000 Qataris. The rest of the people who live in Qatar are actually expats. People who work on building their lovely hotels and stadiums and what have you. So, and 21% are Indians actually. Indian nationals comprise 21% of Qatari population. Qataris are very good at influencing outcomes rather than being direct actors. So you have to understand the nature of the beast. So if China has orchestrated certain things, Qataris will be the ones enabling the money flows, the actual cash flows. So this is one big camp. I'll come back to this. The other camp is the old, what I call the Anglo-American enterprise camp, which is the manifestation of that is one of the things is the Five Eyes intelligence alliance between United States, Canada, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, with maybe 15 left thumbs and 75 feet or whatever. So the old British Empire has devolved into American leadership, and it's no longer a colonial empire, it's more of a military-industrial complex and an industrial empire. They control global banking institutions, global laws, global trade. Essentially, that's how they run it. And to enforce all of it, they have by far the overwhelmingly most powerful military force on earth, even today. So that's the other camp. In that camp, you have these 5 English-speaking Anglophone nations, but you also have EU as a vassal, and you also have certain allies. The most critical of these allies is Israel, not because of its size, but because of its heft in technological matters. The Israelis are by far masters in some of the most critical technologies applicable across the world today. From desalination of seawater, cost-effective desalination, to cheap energy, alternative energy, advanced electronics, designing of new computing technology, all of it, Israelis are at the forefront, and defense technology. So America needs Israel like it needs no other nation for these things. And because of Israel's influence in America via its diaspora, it's a symbiotic relationship. It works out very nicely for them. So America will always stand up for Israel. Now sometimes it has to stand up to control and reduce Israel's wrath, because Israel, for all that it's surrounded by 15 times its population in terms of enemies, it is an overwhelming power in the region. region. It's like wildly asymmetric. You can't even begin to compare Israeli military might with any of these Arab nations or even Iran for that matter. Now I keep hearing, oh, this is going to be a third world war if the conflict will enlarge. Even if it does, I don't see any of the other nations having the capacity to militarily take on, even if they're together, Israel. And right now, there's no case for any of the potential enemies actually combining, because post Abraham Accords and post the thawing relationship between the Saudis and the Israelis, whatever they say on the face of it, they may pass resolutions and censure Israeli action. They say this is not done, we have to look after. Whatever they say, in reality, what are they doing? Nothing. They're actually neutral. They're not going to join in any war, no matter what mainstream media likes to blaze headlines. तृतीय विश्व युद्ध चालू होने वाला है, कहाँ चालू होने वाला है, कहाँ हो रहा है, कौन assemble कर रहा है, who's mobilizing, where is the power? No, it's not happening. Secondly, if you've noticed, America has rapidly deployed enough forces all around the Middle East, right from Eastern Mediterranean all the way down Red Sea, all the way to the Persian Gulf. Anybody actually does any pipsqueak, they're going to be immediately thumped down extremely hard by the all-powerful American Air Force and the all-powerful American Navy. So this is the alignment. So you have the US, the Anglophone countries, EU, Israel. Then on the east you have Japan, South Korea, Australia, Singapore. The Southeast Asian nations are caught between China and America. They're not sort of either here or there. And then we have this very interesting quadrilateral called India. Where does India stand in all this? So India stands in all this in favor of India. Let's be very clear. It's not about friendship. Clearly, we have a lot of affinity and incredible sympathy, which is very genuine, very emotional for Israelis, because unlike all these other nations which have had some smatterings of terrorist attacks, the two countries on earth which have suffered from this form of religion and inspired terrorism are India and Israel. That's a matter of life and death, and that's a matter of fact. People may or may not recognize it in the West. Sometimes even Jews don't acknowledge it, those who live in the West. But they all know it. Israelis certainly know it, and Indians certainly know it. So we have this affinity. However, then there are the problems. Now look at the other theaters. So India, it's in India's interest to not let Russia align with China. So India can't completely cut off Russia. Why? Because if that happens, the Chinese get access to Russian resources and technology. And China no longer needs to depend on Africa, Middle East and other nations or India for food and energy. You can get it from Russia, right? They still can, it still is. But complete alignment of Russia and China would mean a big thumbs down for India. China will definitely be able to attack India if that happens. So we can't afford to let Russia swing China's way completely. The Russians have swung China's way completely for now. It's a temporary alliance, but it's there. And why is it temporary? Because at some level, because they're bordering nations and because China wants land and Russia needs population, there is an inherent conflict. Russia is deficient in population, surplus in land. China has a lot of land, but most of it is useless. You can't live in frigid deserts in Tibet or Xinjiang. You got to live in the coastal areas of China or the central plains. So China needs land because it's still got the world's second largest population, and Russia needs people. But Russia doesn't want Chinese to occupy Siberia. They want people from other places, and they still consider themselves a European nation, right? They still want to actually work with Europe and America. Why? And this has, I think, been out on social media. Other people have referred to it. So if you notice, Russia has said we will again restart grain exports, which has been a reason why worldwide inflation is going up. If you rejoin us with the SWIFT system, Russia was chucked out of SWIFT, which is the global payment settlement system, by the Americans due to sanctions. So if you don't really want to be with them and you really want to participate in some China-led project to de-dollarize, why are you asking to rejoin SWIFT? So clearly Russia is caught between a bad situation on one side and potential rival as an ally on the other. Because China, for example, is now saying we are a near Arctic nation. Now China is a minimum 3,000 miles from the Arctic. How is it a near Arctic nation? It's claiming Eastern Russian territory as its own. So there is conflict.
So as for you, like Russia and China, they are not possessing this infidelity for any of them.
Russia and China, I'll come to what happened in this conflict. Russia and China are, it's a relationship of convenience. Friends with benefits, as they say in social context. So it's a relationship of convenience. I don't think it's going to last. It'll probably last for the next 4-5 years while this current, I would say, avatar of the conflict, global conflict, lasts. Beyond that, I think they'll split. They will definitely move apart. In this interregnum, India can't afford for Russia to completely side with China. That will be bad for India. So, where does India lie? So, India is for India, which means that we support the two-state solution, which is not merely the stated government position, it's a practical thing. You will have to ultimately divide up that land, and this is for Jews and this is for Palestine. You got to have that sort of solution. That's the only possible solution, practically. And you can't have the land split in such a way that there's a pocket of Palestinians here in Gaza and a pocket there and some Jews living in West Bank. Can't work like that. It can't be a mishmash. It has to be a clean break. Otherwise, you'll get the same conflict we are sustaining in India, where there was supposed to be population exchange, but there wasn't when the partition happened, right? So we had borders, but those borders were established in a very haphazard way, and certain, I would say, predominantly Hindu districts went to Bangladesh or to Pakistan and vice versa. So that has to be resolved. I don't think it will get resolved because these are now set. But there is an opportunity to reset that because Israel is a smaller place, fewer people, displacement will be less. Gaza is only 1/7 of the total Palestinian population in that region. So you're talking about displacing 1/7, maybe 1/8. But there are not too many Jews in West Bank. There are some, around I think 100,000, 110,000 odd. So that's not, again, not a massive number to move across. So you can have a solution there. Who doesn't want a solution and who wants a conflict? So let's look at the other big conflict going on currently, which is extremely expensive and extremely costly in terms of human lives, Ukraine. Why did the Ukraine conflict happen? So I will not get into a detailed explanation of that. I'll suffice it to say that the same actors are behind the proxy conflict called Ukraine, as are behind the actors for this new Middle Eastern situation vis-a-vis Israel and Hamas, i.e. China. If you look at the sequence of events, there was this Winter Olympics, Putin goes to Beijing. Putin has been saying that if Ukraine continues on the path to NATO membership, we will attack. It was not a surprise at all. CIA had given their briefings, had categorically warned American leadership, and in fact Biden did state that Russia might attack Ukraine. So that attack was coming, right? China merely sort of dictated the timing of it. They said that let this Winter Olympics, which is a showcase for Chinese might, let it be over, and then you attack. China has been supporting Russia. And at the same time, it's speaking to Zelensky, saying, oh, we are going to help you to fix this. So they essentially create conflicts and then try to solve it to appear as the great power. So if you don't have the capacity to police the world like the Americans do, what do? What's the next thing you can do? You create conflicts and solve them. It's like I create a problem and I'm the solution. It's the Gabbar Singh approach. The only person who can save you from Gabbar Singh is Gabbar Singh himself. That's China for you. So China, we have to understand today, is essentially a feudocracy. It's communist in name, but it's essentially a single party system politically, which in turn is controlled by certain people, certain families. And it's headed by a person who has risen by virtue of eliminating all his rivals, or people who perceives as rivals. The person that Xi Jinping reminds me of most is Joseph Jugashvili, that is Stalin. Stalin did exactly the same thing. And if you look at the type of economic reforms and political actions and geopolitical actions Xi Jinping is taking, it's exactly like what Stalin did and what Mao practiced to some extent, which is to create a lot of trouble and conflict around the world, export ideas of conflict, and then appear as saviors and thereby seek influence in that region. This distracts people away from home issues And in the meanwhile, I am going to bring back communist principles to govern the state, recreate what Mao had started. These are official statements from him. So people still have the illusion that China is actually this rapidly growing economy, gigantic economy, enormous opportunity. It's no longer so. They don't care about economics. Run by this particular version, this avatar of the CCP ruled by Jinping, China is becoming a nation which is more interested in geopolitical muscle flexing than anything else. It can't do so via its military forces, which, large as they are, have a lot of weaknesses. We can have a proper whole series of discussions on their equipment issues and morale issues and training issues and command and control issues, but that's a huge topic.
Yeah.
Suffice it to say, China is not necessarily as strong as it appears. Economically, we've all heard the stories and know the facts. 30% of its economy is real estate. It's completely crashed. It's defaulted on payment of international bonds. Its exports are down 26% year on year. All of these things are known. It's in trouble. 25% of its employment age people are out of work. So China is not a success story internally anymore. So it had to create a conflict. First, it did so in Ukraine. So all the attention of naturally the Europeans went there, and the Americans found a possibility of using Ukraine as a proxy to trouble Russia, and in turn, therefore, China. Chinese found the other way around. We'll use Russia to fight the West, absorb Western equipment, degrade Western equipment, absorb Western ammunition stores, finish it off. But this war by itself has had impact on things like food inflation, because Russia and Ukraine are two of the largest food exporters worldwide. They have small populations and a lot of food, so they export it. So food prices, which has a direct impact on wholesale price index and so on. Second thing is these are energy exporters. Russia is a massive energy exporter. If you sanction Russia, then what will happen is Russia will use other nations to reprocess, value add and re-export. For example, India, but that boosts up the price of energy, right? The moment another intermediary comes in the middle, as many intermediaries as you add, price gets added up in each section. So the end point price becomes higher, so energy costs go up, right? Even if Nord Stream pipeline was not destroyed, this would have happened. So if you take that aside, it still wasn't solving China's purpose. China, remember, has invested hugely in what it calls the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. So the Belt and Road Initiative has so far absorbed $1.1 trillion in actual money, but $9 trillion is allocated to it, and it's already budgeted. So you are building this mammoth infrastructure across the world by lending people money at fairly stiff rates, and to people who probably can't sustain it. Because see, the point is, a trade route sustains when the hinterland of the area it passes through has demand. It can absorb the goods, right? It's not just point A to point B alone. This is how you create viable trade routes. So for example, they created this port in Hambantota in Sri Lanka. Apart from a military possibility of upsetting India militarily, what use does it have? Where does Sri Lanka have the capacity to absorb goods? And why would people go to Sri Lanka? They can easily go to Cochin, which is just 150 miles away, maybe 250 miles away, or they could go via Singapore. They don't need to actually touch Hambantota at all. It's a pointless thing. Which major economy will you service? India, right? So why are you building in Sri Lanka? Doesn't make sense. So a lot of the stuff they have invested in are unviable, and by the time they have already built the infrastructure, it's a bit too late. So they have to keep it going. Suddenly you have the announcement of the IMEC, the India, Middle East, Europe corridor, which is cost effective because it's only $5.5 billion, doesn't go to trillions, and it connects some of the most vibrant and dynamic economies in the world, right? In terms of production as well as consumption. Therefore, this completely upsets the north-south corridor between St. Petersburg all the way down to Bandar Abbas in Iran. It upsets the Chinese, CPEC project, the flagship of their BRI, which passes through Karakoram into Pakistan, into Gwadar. All these become redundant. Because the major centers of consumption, that is Europe, India and America. Right now globally these are the major centers of consumption. China is, but then China is right now in trouble. If you don't connect these, then what's the point? So they had to do something. So remember the question I asked at the outset of this slightly long ramble is, why now? Conflict to chal raha hai. Conflict's going on. So why now? The why now is essentially because the IMEC came up. So they had anyway decided to do this. By the way, if I the last bit I want to just look at the military situation. This was planned for at least a couple of years. Stockpiling of rockets, stockpiling of supplies, and training the people. This was a mass coordinated assault. It was fairly complex. It was air element, sea element, underground element, and land element. 4 different elements, coordinating all of that, not easy, and strike across multiple points. So you had to have 2 years of preparation to pull something off like this. It's not like an incursion by 50 people and do a Uri type strike. That doesn't take more than a month to plan and execute. This would take years to plan and execute. So they were already ready. They always wanted to do this. They were already in conflict. I think the trigger was the signing of the IMEC memorandum in New Delhi during the G20 summit. A lot of people are saying, no, IMEC has no relationship with this. I totally disagree. That will be a new takeaway from whatever we have discussed today. IMEC definitely was the trigger point. By the way, that's been ratified by the US administration as well. They also are saying the same thing. So this all points to clearly China orchestrating Iran and potentially Turkey, which is a NATO member but plays both sides. They're part of the Chinese camp. Iran and Turkey planning, providing the logistics for the last 2 years. It's also clear from the signature of the attacks done on the civilians in Israel that this is the training, one of the major training resources came from Pakistan. Because it's the same hallmark used by the Pakistan-trained terrorists who attacked Mumbai in 2008. Exactly the same type of attacks happened, right? So Pakistani involvement is clear. There are ample photographic evidences which have emerged showcasing how Hamas operatives have been trained in SSG training centers of Pakistan. That's the Pakistani Special Forces. So they are obviously involved. Now let's look at the final bit, which is the military situation. The military situation is very interesting. The thing is, Gaza, unlike, there are 2 aspects to it. Yes, it's a highly built up, incredibly, it's the world's most densely populated piece of urban territory, Gaza. The second highest, I think, is Karachi. Delhi is nowhere near as close, but Gaza is incredibly densely populated. It's like, I think it's roughly about 1/3 or slightly more than 1/4 the size of, say, South Delhi, right? That's the kind of area, but it's got 11 lakh people, 1.1 billion people live there, probably slightly more, because the census taking is very inaccurate and imperfect over there. The average age of a Gazan is 17. There are more children than grown-ups. Anyway, they are drafted by the age of 15 to train as terrorists in Hamas and an even more virulent organization called the Palestine Islamic Jihad, PIJ. So, there are 3-4 things all well known now. There are extensive network of tunnels which are located beneath hospitals, schools and built up areas in Gaza, right? So if you attack these tunnels, which Israelis have done, there will be collateral damage because it's surrounded by houses of people, by schools, by shops, workshops, etc. It will create collateral damage because everything is, it's not like open terrain where it's a mountain and there are some subterranean caves. No, it's just the mountains here are the buildings. The buildings have been brought down. I think almost all of northern Gaza has been flattened by Israeli bombing. I think some 15,000 tons of, I'm making a mistake, maybe there were about 3,000 strikes. So if you assume an average of 300 kilos per strike, so that's 9,000 tons approximately thereabouts. That's a lot. So, but that will not destroy the Hamas fighters because it's not just tunnels, they have underground caverns. They have literally created underground warren of areas where they can stage, they can live, they can eat. There have been, UN for example, there was a controversy recently, United Nations Relief Organization, they were saying that they have stolen our petrol, and then they took that tweet away, but people had seen it by then. So Hamas has been stockpiling fuel, not just now by stealing from the UN, they've been doing it for years. They have got food, they have got generator sets, because these tunnels are 100 to 150 feet beneath the ground, very deep, which means you have to have artificial source of air, which can only be operated by machines. You have to create air ducts, and that has to be kept going through electricity. Electricity is destroyed because Israelis used to provide electricity. They continue supplying electricity to the southern part of Gaza, but they have stopped everywhere else. So they have to depend on generators, and you need fuel for that. So this is the situation. Now, there are claims about 40,000 trained Hamas fighters, but I would say it's very difficult to figure out how many of them are trained to what extent. What kind of training? I can't believe there are 40,000 people trained to special forces level. No single country on earth has that. So probably 1,000, 1,200 of them might be highly trained. Then you have people who can carry guns and can shoot. They're not really trained to that extent. They have been indoctrinated with extreme visions of success against the Jews via Islamic fervor. And you have probably 10, 12,000 people who can be described as guerrillas or reservists who have had some training, military training, not merely carrying guns. They know a bit more. So they have tactical ability. They can form squads and assault. But nothing which can compete with a all-arms operation of the type Israelis can launch, where you have tanks backed by infantry fighting vehicles, backed by air defense, backed by assault squads, etc., combined attack, and backed by close air support. Hamas has nothing of the sort. So this is obviously not going to be a conventional conflict. If Israelis go in and they have to clear house by house, now imagine trying to clear 50,000 such houses. Simply not possible. So there are certain options available, however. For example, if you can stop the air supply into the tunnels will be useless. They'll have to emerge. If they stay there, they'll die for lack of oxygen. So one is cut off that. So you have to destroy their electricity generation and capacity. So cut off the fuel. That's one. Second is you can use nerve gas. Nerve gas essentially renders you paralyzed temporarily, and then people can come and just pick you up. Now, assuming the fighters of Hamas carry guns, it'd be fairly easy to identify who's a potential threat and who's just a normal civilian. So that's one way of doing it. So the civilian gets knocked out, say 10 civilians get knocked out, or one terrorist also gets knocked out. You bring all of them out, segregate the gun carrier, and take him away. Now, Israelis do have intel on some of the Hamas members, so they have lists of names, especially in the higher echelons. But they don't know all of them clearly, because generation after generation is getting trained or indoctrinated or radicalized. So they'll have to go by visual confirmation, they have to affirm. So again, it's a tedious process. You can't segregate very easily. So in reality, what will happen will be a mix. We should not forget that people in Israel, every single one of them, Jew as well as Arab, there are Arab Israelis as well, about 1 million, 1.5 million of them. They're part of the IDF. They're itching to fire and kill Hamas terrorists. So you can't stop the whole thing and make it this benign operation where you are anesthetizing people for surgery. It's not going to be a nerve gas operation. It's going to be a combination of all of these things. Horses for courses, where it's very clear there's an assemblage of 500 fighters, for example. 500 terrorists, they will strike, they'll use airstrikes, they'll send tanks in, there'll be a firefight. People will get killed. Civilians will also get killed. Because let's not forget, the Hamas invariably uses citizens as a shield, like ordinary civilians as a shield. They'll place women and children in front and shoot from behind them. So they will get killed. That's their hope, because that will create anger, and if they can spread it to the rest of the Arab world, that will cause censure of Israel. Which is why America is stationed everywhere. It is not just to prevent attacks on Israel, it is also for preventing other nations in the neighborhood, even if they are right now benign or neutral, from suddenly getting a blaze of anger in their heads and doing something hasty. So it's for that.
So, do you think this Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon will ultimately join the war?
Hezbollah might, because it's also a question of face. I mean, Hezbollah claims this massive, great army, right? They have 1 lakh fighters and 1.5 lakh rockets and blah 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 blah, right? And if they do nothing when this great crisis, so-called great crisis, has come upon the Palestinians, then they will lose power. They'll lose power. They'll lose credibility. Most important, currency for a terrorist organization. So Hezbollah might. Lebanon anyway is ruled by Hezbollah. It has a government on paper, but they don't call the shots. The army can't stand up to the Hezbollah. So it will be a Hezbollah attack. Syria has no capacity currently for any official action. They're too embroiled in the civil war, which has been raging for 9 years now in Syria. They have no capacity to intervene in Israel. Let's look at the other nations in the region. Jordan will do nothing, absolutely nothing. They are a US vassal and definitely very close to Israel. They may say whatever they like on the face of it. Their queen is a Palestinian, by the way. Queen Raina is a Palestinian. So, and they have been talking about reconciling with the Palestinians with whom there was a rift after the 1970 rebellion. But that aside, they are not going to do anything. Egypt obviously is already not doing anything. Not only is it not doing anything, it's helping the Israelis. They in fact warned them about the Hamas, potential Hamas attack. So the Egyptians will do zilch. Saudis are absolutely quiet. In fact, they have now said there should be no protests on the streets. We need law and order and peaceful nation. Israelis are very bad people. Very bad. We should not talk about them. Very bad. But they should do nothing. So effectively, Saudi Arabia is saying, we are not going to do anything at all. And if I look at the rest, Bahrain has supported Israel, UAE has supported Israel, Qatar is clearly aligned with China. And incidentally, one thing I forgot, most of terror, which is these days narco-terror, because the source of funding is human trafficking and drugs. That's what they do. How is it paid for? So the main payment, the gathering of payment is no longer in cash, it's done in bitcoins and cryptocurrency. Who manufactures 90% of cryptos in the world? China. All the roads lead to Beijing, or at least Shanghai. So, so Qatar will be sorted. Recently, yesterday they declared that they're going to execute 8 Indians who are actually helping Qatar induct their own stealth submarines purchased from Italy. But they're going to execute them for spying on behalf of Israel. I haven't heard of anything more weird and what should I say? It's absurd. Let's put it this way. It's simply absurd because if Israel needs to spy on Qatar, it has got enough resources of its own to do so. Israel has a highly effective foreign intelligence organization called Mossad, who have enough Arab agents of their own as well, including in Qatar, in Doha. And the Qataris know that. They don't need Israeli ex-Navy officials doing consulting on naval warship induction to do spying. Spying on what? What does Qatar have that India needs to spy on? Nothing. What does Qatar have that Israel needs to spy on? Again, nothing. So the only spying that will be done will be probably all the financial grey transactions that Qatar facilitates. But for that you don't need ex-naval officers of India. So this is clearly something else that's going on. But Qatar will get sorted in the process. It's high time. It was, I think, 2 or 3 years ago, it was sanctioned by all the GCC nations. They said no flights, airspace denial, not a single Qatari aircraft will take off, or any aircraft will land in Qatar. Essentially said that we are withdrawing our ambassadors, which they did. So Qatar was in a doghouse. Now Qatar will again go back in the doghouse, and USA will simply not do anything because it doesn't need to do anything. USA not doing anything is good enough to sort Qatar out. But the thing is that if USA thinks it needs to protect its base in Qatar, that's the leverage Qataris have on the US, then it might become a bit of a problem sorting them out. See, Hamas's leadership lives in Qatar. They are operating out of Gaza, and the civilians live in Gaza, and these people live in palaces in Doha. or in presidential suites in some of the best 5-star or 7-star hotels in Manama and Doha. Sorry, not Manama, Doha. So I think right now we are poised in a situation where I don't see escalation, and I say that with full knowledge and responsibility of the fact that the Iranians, have flown this black flag which signifies war. So they're flying those. But these are symbolic things. I don't see, what will Iran do? Fire a few missiles? At what? Most of those missiles will not have effect, and the Iranians know it. They may supply very effective and cheap drones to the Hamas and Hezbollah people, so there will be damage from that. Again, with the same proxy war. So at best, this will become a very confused situation with various non-state actors like Hezbollah, Hamas, PIJ, ISIS, etc., which are proxies for the Iranians these days and the Chinese, creating trouble in the region. That's it. I don't see it going beyond that. However, consequence of this is it creates a lot of uncertainty, and that's a given. Uncertainty implies there will be oil shocks, energy price shocks. Things like the IMEC will get delayed, right? When you have energy price shocks on top of the price shock from Ukraine war, it will create more inflation, more unemployment, etc. In the developed nations, and have it spill over in the developing nations. So as inflation and unemployment rises, their demand goes down. So exports from developing nations like India will also go down, right? On the other hand, if they want to, it might get counteracted somewhat, because if demand goes down, you counteract that by reducing cost, which means you go for labor arbitrage in countries like India or Bangladesh or Vietnam, etc. So there is a counter impact of that. So I see an overall higher inflationary environment, higher interest rates, higher energy prices, greater unemployment, and overall conditions which are ripe for, I would say, another reset. But I don't see problems getting solved this time with further, monetization, which is what the US and the others did last time in 2008, and again partly in 2011 under the Obama administration. That's not a solution. The capacity for going on printing notes to boost up the economy and demand and consumption is limited by the current situation, because you don't essentially fight inflation by printing more notes. You fight inflation by reducing money supply, not making it more liberal. They are in fact printing notes to counteract unemployment side effects, but the problem is inflation. Real problem is inflation. Inflation is going to destroy demand, and that's what is causing unemployment. So instead of addressing that, they're addressing this. So it all depends on how people react to, I would say, two interesting data points would be what happens during the Indian elections in 6 months' time, and the policies that will be rolled out right after. I'm sure there will be a mini budget which will declare certain economic policies. So a lot will be decided by that. However, I would say that India should ride this out by staying neutral. We should supply Israel with weapons if they ask for it, because it's an ally nation, and they have always helped India when required. We should give humanitarian aid to Palestinians in West Bank. We should just stay out of Gaza and make no comments. Israel has demanded we declare Hamas a terrorist organization. Personally, I think there should be no problem doing that, because their actions indicate, nothing but terrorism. Can't be called anything else. And there are political gains to doing that. If you combine it side by side by reaffirming support for the West Bank Palestinian Authority, the Arabs will be fine. That India is not being biased. It's simply saying Hamas is terrorist, which most people anyway agree. Nobody has a huge problem throwing Hamas under the bus. So, one more thing is, I think the Chinese policy of using proxy non-state actors to further its geopolitical objectives is backfiring badly. It is backfiring very badly, because everybody has realized China is behind this and now trying to be a very nice guy, saying, oh, we'll help you solve the conflict. It doesn't work that way. People are not fools. And secondly, it is going to lose massive influence in the Gulf particularly. None of these nations recognize China as a beneficial actor anymore. At best, it's a transactional player with whom they can have some trade. They can't see China as somebody they can align with, after this especially. Because all it has done is disrupt everything. Nobody likes disruption, particularly governments which are paranoid and want to survive, which is pretty much everyone. It's not just that dictators are paranoid. Even democratic governments can be paranoid. So that's what one has to remember. Anyway, so I think I've said whatever I needed to say.
So let me be very honest to all my audience and Mr. Shamik Moitra over here. Like most of my questions which I was supposed to ask, or I've jotted down somewhere, most of them are answered actually the way he explained everything. So I would again request all of my audience over there, so you are always welcome to ask us any questions regarding this topic. Again, you are always welcome to comment us. We would love to hear it from you. So moving on to our next question, like how do you think that it will long drawn like Ukraine war, and if so, how will it affect India and the subcontinent?
So I see the Hamas action as a couple of months at best, not beyond that, but this will metastasize into longer conflict around the periphery of Israel, which will involve Hezbollah, which will involve the terror groups camped in Syria. It will involve those. And there will be a lot of action there. Now, what happens beyond it all depends on what the Russians do in Syria and what the Chinese do by way of further sustenance via Iran, Turkey, Qatar to these groups. So it depends on that, but again, I see that as the same kind of low-level conflict which has anyway been persisting for the last 9 years in Syria. It will just be a bit more widespread. It may spread a bit further to Iraq. Iraq is primarily a Shia country. Only under Saddam was it controlled by the Sunnis, who are 15% of the population. So it will spread a bit to Iraq. It will cause some discomfort. It will cause the loss of few thousand servicemen's lives in Israel as well as America, but nothing much beyond. I'm being slightly clinical, but that's what will happen. Nothing will change massively. This will all settle in the next 3-4 years. All these conflicts will also die down. As China's capacity for indefinitely sustaining these things also gets decimated. There are other actions which are happening in the South China Sea, in Taiwan, and so on and so forth. So China's attention will also get soaked in, and things are underway to ensure that happens.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shamik, for having a wonderful conversation with us. To all my audience who are listening to us, please don't forget to like, share and subscribe to this channel, and also press the bell icon for the latest notifications. We are going to come back to you soon again with the more hot and trending topics and more interesting conversations like this. Stay tuned with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Namaskar.